can get through with everything around here. We've asked you before just to bear with us if you're going to stay here. Well, we could put a minimum of maybe 10 years on it because we'll just be winding up with things maybe from 10 years from now. You have to bear with us because we're working on all of it. I've got a lot of this stuff ready, but there's just so much you can say in 1 hour. Unless you just talk twice as fast, and you could say twice as much. But really no one would catch all that. You couldn't get all of it down. You couldn't put it into practice. You couldn't understand it or just about anything. It's remarkable. I guess in one way we're blessed to be born at the end of the ages, but then again, if we had been born maybe the end of the 1800s and still confessing that we were going to live till Jesus came back, we'd still be alive today, which means we would have had that much more time to study and to learn these things. We don't really know how much time we have left before he comes back, but we know that we're living in the last days because the signs of the times are being fulfilled. But he impressed on us to deal with this subject of creation, so that's what we're having to spend time with, and I've said before, we might as well do a good job of it the first time, because we could be through by now. We could be through with the Old Testament by now if we wanted to be. But I don't want to be. I hope you don't, but I don't want to be through with it yet. Because we would have just gone past things so fast, I don't know if we would have caught everything. But I've just been working a lot lately on New Testament introduction that will start sometime next year, and I can already tell it's going to be a blessing to get in and answer some important questions from the New Testament. But of course, we won't spend as much time there as we will with the Old Testament. Yes, so many other things. You can see why they taught day and night in the book of Acts, just to get everything out there. So maybe sometime we'll change again and do something different on our schedule. I don't know. I've been thinking about that, but I just don't know. But we'll wait until we know for sure before we do anything, and then we'll all be in one accord and everyone will be ready to do whatever we do. But we don't know anything about changing now, so we'll continue going along this line. Well, let's go back to Genesis 1. We're on the 4th day of creation. We want to deal with one question tonight. Why were the luminaries created? This is our 4th week now on the 4th day of creation. We come to this evening still on verses 14 through 19, still on the 4th day, but the question of why were the luminaries created? Now we're going to read through these verses again, and then I'm going to come back and we'll go through them for a second time and just point out on the surface all the different reasons that we're told. I think we're given about 9 or 10. Here in verses 14 through 19, we'll be able to sum them up under 3, though. But you might want to just get down what they say here, what Moses has written. God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. And he made the stars also. Just tacked on to the end of the verse there, the rest of the universe, which remember about 98% of the mass of the universe is found in the stars. But remember, he gives prominence to the earth, then to the sun, then to the moon, because those are the things that concern us as his creation. And the rest of the universe, which is what the stars are, he just tacks on as a footnote to verse 16. He made the stars also. I heard someone in a Christian college had a class in astronomy, of course a Christian class, a Christian professor, and that was the name of the class, The Stars Also. And he had taken it from Genesis 1:16. God set them in the expanse of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. The evening was, the morning was, day 4. Okay, back to verse 14, and let's just look on the surface the reasons that he gives. God said, let there be lights in the expanse of heaven. Number 1, to divide the day from the night. That's, first of all, a purpose for the luminaries, to divide the day from the night. And let them be, number 2, for signs. He's going to create the luminaries for signs. Thirdly, and for seasons. Fourthly, and for days. Fifthly, and for years. Verse 15, and let them be for lights. The 6th purpose is he created them so they could give light on the earth. It's going to say that 3 times, twice in verse 15. Let them be for lights in the expanse of heaven, to give light upon the earth. So twice in verse 15 he said their purpose is to give light. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day. There's a 7th reason, to rule the day, and it's going to say that twice. The lesser light to rule the night. I think that's an 8th purpose. He made the stars also. God set them in the expanse of heaven to give light upon the earth. Going back to your 6th purpose, there's the 3rd time. It says that the purpose of the luminaries is to give light on the earth. Verse 18, to rule over the day. The 2nd time it said that. And to rule over the night. The 2nd time it said that. And to divide the light from the darkness. Number 9. God saw that it was good. The evening was, the morning was, day 4. So it started off with the first purpose, to divide the day from the night. And of course it's essentially the same thing, but it's called something different. In verse 18 it says to divide the light from the darkness. Well, we can sum all of these up under 3 categories. In answer to the question, why did God create the luminaries? First of all, and you'll see how all of these that we just mentioned that are covered there in the surface of Genesis 1, 14 to 19, can be placed under one of these 3 categories. First of all, a purpose for the luminaries is to give light. That's their very name, luminaries. We call them luminaries. They are called here in verse 14, God said, let there be lights. Or really the Hebrew says light bearers. So they were things to bear light to the earth. Let there be lights. Now remember, this includes planets, it includes everything out there. And if they don't have light inherently, they can always reflect the light of the sun or some other star. So just because they don't have any light themselves does not mean that's not included in what he's covering here. But he's not giving us a detailed astronomical account of creation or of the universe. Otherwise, since we do live in the particular solar system and galaxy we do, and we know that we have 8 other planets beside ourselves in this particular solar system, he could have gone right on in verse 16 after mentioning the stars and said, and I'm going to give you the planets too. Mercury and Venus and Earth and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus and Neptune and Pluto. And explain a lot of other things. But remember, that's not his intent here, to give us a complete, detailed, systematized scientific account. But he gives us just what he wants us to know. Now, this particular reason he gives lights appears, 8 times. It appears more than any other reason here in verses 14 through 19. We're going to see that their basic underlying purpose was simply to provide light. Now, when you go down to, well, let's see, the end of verse 14, it says, let them be for signs, seasons, days, years. Now, when you just look at that, that's what we gave you as a surface outline for the reason why the luminaries are created. There you've got 4 reasons: for signs, for seasons, for days, for years, and that excludes lights right away. So I can just throw in here for free that there's a lot of discussion over exactly how many reasons can we find, are we allowed to find, here in verses 14 to 19 for the reason of the luminaries being created. You'll find some say there are 2 reasons, some 3, some 4, some 5, on down the line. But as you'll see, or I trust you'll see, basically there are 3 reasons why we have the luminaries created. Now I said, first of all, for lights, we see this 8 times. Verse 14, God said, let there be lights. There's 1 time. In the expanse of the heaven to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs, seasons, days, years. Let them be for lights. In the expanse of heaven to give light upon the earth. There's, 3 times? God made 2 great lights. 4 times the greater light. 5 times to rule the day, the lesser light. 6 times to rule the night. He made the stars also. Verse 17, God set them in the expanse of heaven to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and the night, which again is light. To divide light from darkness, God saw that it was good. So if you count up the actual times where you see light appearing, you'll see it appearing 8 times. Now, with the institution of the luminaries in the 4th day, we have a negation of whatever light source, and I've mentioned this before, but just to mention it again, that we have in verses 3 and 4. Whatever light source that is, we have a negation of that now with the institution of the luminaries, the fixed luminaries in verse 14. One thing that's interesting, going back to verse 4, is the fact that when God created light, once he created light and saw that it was good, then the Bible says that God divided the light from the darkness. He had to do something here himself. Whereas in verse 14, now that we're going to have our fixed and relatively permanent luminaries, I mean permanent so far as the earth is here, verse 4 it says that God divided light from darkness. Verse 14, God said, let there be lights in the firmament, and let them divide the day from the night. Again, showing us a difference, that this is not the sun, back in verses 3 and 4, that simply veiled, as even a lot of conservatives believed, and is not made to appear until verses 14 to 19, and then God says that he made it only so far as meaning that now it appears to the inhabitants of the earth for the first time. But that wouldn't be true, because there is a distinction in the language here in verse 4 and verse 14. God divided in one place, and the lights are to divide in the next place. Now let's go over to Psalm 121. Now, before the days of electricity, the sun and the moon were very, very important. I don't know if it's true most places, but it's especially true in this country that we're not guided by the sun and the moon anymore. I mean, we have a day when most people are up, but most people don't go to bed at 6, so go to bed at 11 or 12 or whenever they go to bed, and you just couldn't do that back then, because you were guided by the day and by the night. When the sun was out, it was day, and it was time for you to be up. When the sun went down, it was dark. You didn't have electricity to light things up for you, so it was dark, and you went to bed. And then, of course, they got up at a different time then. Now, here in Psalm 121, we have a mentioning of the sun and the moon, the greater and the lesser light, where God makes a specific promise here to the people that would have been, well, it's true today, but especially true for them at this period, and in this culture. And by the way, this is one of those verses that we talked about last time, Psalm 121, verses 4 through 8, where they get the alleged teaching of moon sickness, being struck by the moon. Remember, there's another verse over there in Genesis that talks about, or it looks like it talks about the moon being able to cause plants to grow during the nighttime. The sun does his work during the day. When the sun goes down, and the moon is used for photosynthesis or for whatever purpose. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is thy keeper, the Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve thee from all evil, he shall preserve thy soul. The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth and even forevermore. Now, he just means what is obvious here in verse 6, where the sun will not smite you by day. If the people happen to be traveling at night, then of course the moon was the only way you had to travel. Otherwise, you just travel in complete darkness, and that's not the easiest thing to do. So he says the sun's not going to, overdo his purpose, smite you during the day, and the moon's not going to withhold her light. You have to read into the text that the psalmist is trying to teach lunacy here, that a person becomes a lunatic by being struck by the moon. The moon has its purpose, and the sun has its purpose. Now over in Psalm 19, back earlier here in Psalm 19, we have a remarkable passage, verse 4b through verse 6, that does deal with the sun. Again, one of those remarkable truths taught so many centuries before we discovered that truth. And that is that the sun actually moves. Remember how many billions of miles we go through space every year? Our planet, remember, turns, goes around the sun, and our solar system moves, our galaxy moves, the sun moves, everything moves. Well, look in Psalm 19:4b. In them, speaking of the heavens, the expanse, in them hath he set a tabernacle for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. His going forth, well, we've got movement here of the sun. His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it. Now there's one interesting thing that it teaches, that the sun actually does move. Now, not revolve around the earth, but the sun itself actually does move. And there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. Now that's a relative statement. Nothing here as far as we're concerned that's hidden from the heat of the sun. Now right along with this purpose of light, of course, goes heat. We don't have to add that in there as a separate reason for the creation of the luminaries, because if something's going to be producing some light, then it's also going to be producing some heat, and that, of course, is one of the basic functions of the sun also. Going back to Genesis, a second purpose for the creation of the luminaries is they serve as a calendar. Now, in all these things where it says seasons, days, years, nights, basically those four different things, well, we can sum all that up in that the luminaries are created to serve as a calendar for us. This is stated 6 times in verses 14 through 19, in 6 different ways, that the sun, the moon, the other luminaries to serve as a calendar, day, night, monthly, yearly, seasons, in whichever way you want to break it up. Back over into the book of Psalms, several passages. Psalm 74, verses 16 through 17. We've looked at this before. Psalm 74:16. The day is thine, the night also is thine. Thou hast prepared the light and the sun. Thou hast set all the borders of the earth. Thou hast made summer and winter. Well, that's due to the responsibility of the sun, the moon, the other luminaries, the way they've been placed there to give us our summer and winter. That's the same thing back in Genesis 1:14 as our seasons. Then in Psalm 104, in verse 19, He appointed the moon for seasons, the sun knoweth his going down. So it says the same thing in this particular place. Now also let us cover ahead of time that the seasons that are mentioned here in verse 14 are given more or less proleptically. If you look over in Genesis 8 and verse 22, because otherwise you might have a misunderstanding of what we've said before concerning the uniform universal climate, the pre-flood, the antediluvian climate that the earth experienced. Now, if he says in verse 14 of Genesis 1 that we have seasons, does that mean that we have snow in Genesis 1? No. Not at all. Now, after the flood, chapter 8 and verse 22, now we have a little more specific promise of heat and cold, summer and winter, that there will never be a ceasing of those, of course, until the earth is through. That's what he says, while the earth remaineth, until the earth is changed. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So it's from this time that we begin to have the seasons as severe as we know them. I'm talking especially about summer and winter. We have those as severe, starting with the time immediately following the flood as we experience them today. But in Genesis 1:14, it's simply speaking concerning the seasons ahead of time. Psalm 136. Verses 1 to 9. You see, the heavenly bodies are so precise and so specific in what the Bible calls their ordinances. We'll look at that probably next week. The ordinances of heaven speaks of their paths and their movements, that they are so precise and so specific that we gauge our time by them. Now, they are much more precise than the best watch anyone could ever make, because if you leave it there long enough, let's say 10,000 years, as long as the sun's been here, it's going to lose a second or two. But you see, the sun could never lose a second, because it's gauging its time by itself. It's not dependent on anything else to find out whether it lost a second or not, you see. But all of our watches and clocks and all these things are dependent on the ordinances of heaven and the luminaries to find out whether they're on time or off time. And even the best of them. And some of them, like mine's about a 298 watch here, and no telling what time it really is if I looked on my watch and told you time. I don't have the most expensive watch. Mine says 8:57. Oh, it just changed to 58 there. Well, see, I got no idea whether that's right. Anyone got 8:58? Oh, praise the Lord. Mine is right then. Quit criticizing him then. But I didn't pay very much for it, so honestly, I don't really trust the thing. I mean, it's going to give me the right hour. I mean, I know I'm not really living in yesterday. I know today is today. But I trust the sun a lot more than I trust my watch. Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. Oh, give thanks unto the God of gods, for his mercy endureth forever. Oh, give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his mercy endureth forever. To him who alone doeth great wonders, for his mercy endureth forever. To him that by wisdom made the heavens, for his mercy endureth forever. One passage we saw, it said that he stretched out the heavens by his discretion. I think that was over in Jeremiah 10. Here it says he's made the heavens by his wisdom. Verse 6, to him that stretched out the earth above the waters. That goes back to what? The second day of creation there. dry land made to appear. You've got water below that. You've got water above that. To him that made great lights, for his mercy endureth forever. The sun to rule by day, for his mercy endureth forever. And now this adds on a little commentary to Genesis 1:16. There it says that the moon is the lesser light to rule the night, but here it says the moon and the stars to rule by night, for his mercy endureth forever. The sun is the thing placed there to rule by day, and all the other bodies that we can see are placed there to rule by night. Now those were the quickest reasons, lights and calendar. Now we come to one that we'll have to spend a little more time on, and that's just found mentioned one time in verse 14. Now you see the seasons, the days, the years, all of that has to do with a calendar. And with the institution of the luminaries here in verse 14, here on the fourth day, then technically we have the beginning of the establishment of a regular system of time. Now before this, we know as time has existed for 3 days. Time began back in verse 1. In the beginning God created. Then we have 3 days leading up to verse 14. But as a fixed system, time comes into being in verse 14. As a fixed permanent system, we have time here. I've got time written out in the margin there to remind me that time is nothing to panic about. God's not ever late or early because he's not bound by time. And he made time here. He made things by which we gauge time, and all time is a measurement of change. When you stop having change, you stop having time. If we were here and none of us ever changed, then how would you know time passed? You wouldn't. You see? All time is a measurement of change. Whenever you get to the place nothing ever changes, then you couldn't go from... See, if you just understand that, then you won't, you'll be a stepping stone ahead of everyone when you start thinking about the afterlife. You think, now, once we get there, can't we say that we've been here a day? No, if you don't have any change anymore, remember Revelation 21? You don't have moon, you don't have sun, you don't have things by which we gauge time. If you don't have a change from one thing to another, then time can't progress. So you see, time's relative. If you understand that, you'll be a step ahead when we get to studying some other things like that. That the old song, "We've been there 10,000 years." How will you know when 10,000 years are up? See, once you've been there one day, you won't know whether it's been a day or 1,000 years. You won't know. You can't, because, how could you know? You're not going to have a watch on, the sun's not going to rise. He said, tell me how you'd know you've been there a day. I bet we could put any of you in a dark room, seal it up completely dark, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and I want you to tell me when it's 9 o'clock the next morning. You'd never guess. Never would you ever guess. You'd guess too early or too late. There's none of us that can guess. Unless maybe you had figured out how to count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. I guess if you sat there and counted all night, but who's going to be wanting to count when you're in the Lamb's Book of Life and you're sitting there at his feet, 1 Mississippi, to find out when the next day is come? But there'd be somebody here that would want to prove me wrong, so they'd want to sit there and count Mississippis when we get there. Or Minnesotas. I guess that's about the same length there. But that's right. You wouldn't know when 24 hours are up. You just know because temperature changes, programs on TV change. Whatever changes, time must be changing now. Things are going along here. Temperature changes, your stomach changes. It's not yesterday, it's today. Because you remember you ate 3. Some of you may ate 5 times yesterday. And it's the next day again, and your stomach knows that something's happened here. We've progressed, in other words. But how are you going to know that then? See, you won't know that. No, you don't want to know. Because the temptation would be to count and to figure out, well, when are my 10,000 years going to be up? You won't want to know. But as soon as you get there, you'll just be there. But see, you'll be living in eternity and not living in time anymore. So you won't know that it was just yesterday that the millennium finally finished, you know. And besides that, there's, of course, a large gap, 45 days or something, between the end of the millennium and the beginning of the eternal state anyway. So you got a lot of time lapses before and after the millennium that things have to be dealt with and done. Well, that brings us to verse 14. What I was saying is all these other things that you see, day, night, the greater light, lesser light to rule seasons, days, years, all these things have to do with calendar. But there in the very end of verse 14, we have our third and final reason for the luminaries: let them be for signs. Now, the other two are easy to understand. This is the most mysterious of the purposes for the creation of the luminaries. Let them be for signs. Now, right away, what some people have found in verse 14, in verse 16, and verse 18, all your even verses on the fourth day of creation, people have found the zodiac. Now, if you've ever talked to people that are caught up in that and they claim to be Christians, then they can bring you back to Genesis 1, 14, 16, and 18. You might as well realize that this is one of their proof texts for finding the zodiac. And of course, what we mean by that is astrology, not just the constellations themselves. We saw Mazzaroth; they do exist there. But notice what verse 16 says: God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape over.
But notice what verse 16 says: God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. Verse 18, and to rule over the day and over the night. In other words, what they see in this is an intrinsic influence that the heavenly bodies have on men's lives here on the earth, because it says to rule over them. So they have found in verse 14, 16, and 18 astrology, the zodiac, and everything that comes along with that. And we also want to deal with another text, and that is over in Judges 5. Some of these things we pass over so that we don't just mention something off the top of our head and not get to cover it well enough. But once we do cover it, then it'll be on tape. It may be hard to find, where your particular question is, because it's scattered over all the Bible, and that means it's scattered over all our tapes and teachings. But if you've ever had a problem with the verse over in Judges 5, then we want to deal with that right now. Judges 5 and verse 20. Now this is under the judgeship of Deborah and her helper Barak. And they're fighting against some of the people up in northern Israel. By name Sisera was the captain, I think, of Jabin's host, who was the king. And look at Judges 5 and verse 20. They fought from heaven, the stars in their courses fought against Sisera. It's amazing how they know just the right verses. Now, they don't know anything about Deuteronomy 18 or Leviticus 19 or Jeremiah 10, but they do know Genesis 1 and Judges 5:20. But since we're Christians, we're supposed to know both of the passages and supposed to be able to answer and deal with both of the passages. Well, let me give you some explanation here. First of all, and see, you already know this now from your study in Judges, there's only one poetical chapter in the whole book. Guess what chapter it is? Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is nothing but poetry. From verse 1 to verse 31, you have a poetical song. Very ancient Hebrew poetical song that's composed by Deborah and Barak. Now remember right away, when you start with something that's poetical, there is the possibility that things can be used symbolically and that we're not to take them literally. Now that's not always the case, because practically the whole book of Psalms is poetry, but there are things that we take there literally. Now, First of all, just get that down, I guess, first of all, that this is poetry. Judges 5 is poetry, which means that at least there is the possibility that verse 20 would be speaking symbolically or poetically, as we would say. Now, going back to verse 4 and verse 5, I want to show you two other verses here that if we take these, well, no one is fool enough to take verse 4 and verse 5 literally in everything that they say. Now, if we can find one thing that is poetical and symbolical here in chapter 5, then we can probably find more than one. And verse 20 would be one of those things that would fit in there. Lord, when thou wentest out of Seir, when thou marchest out of the field of Edom. All right, now did God really march anywhere? You see, that's poetry. It's trying to express God's great presence when he came on the scene there. But did he march anywhere? No. The earth trembled. The earth probably didn't really tremble. The heavens dropped. The clouds also dropped water. Now that did take place, as we'll show you in a moment. Verse 5, the mountains melted from before the Lord, even that Sinai from before the Lord God of Israel. Now they're going all the way back to the time of Exodus here. It doesn't have anything to do with their battle and with their song and with their poetry that they're giving here, except to express some things symbolically. They're saying that God's fighting with us to such a degree. Of course, the whole emphasis here is that God is the one who's fought for his people, and that's why we have some of the natural phenomena that's taking place. And he's comparing it to when Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 19, was all together on a smoke. And remember, the trumpet waxed exceeding loud there, and the mountain literally shook in Exodus 19. But here in verses 4 and 5, we've got many things here in verses 4 and 5 that simply aren't to be taken at face value or for their literal meaning. Secondly, the rest of the Bible condemns such belief in astrology or the influence of the heavenly bodies on men's lives. Now, the Bible's not going to contradict itself. Let's look at several of these passages. This isn't a whole teaching on astrology, which we'll do at another time, but we just want to deal with the verses there in Genesis and the one here in Judges 5 and verse 20. But Deuteronomy 18 and verse 10. We said the Bible itself condemns belief in astrology. Many times spoken of here as those who observe the times. Deuteronomy 18:10, there shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, that useth divination or an observer of times. That's an astrologer, in other words. Just an ancient way to speak of a modern group of people, astrologers. And I think there are, 5,000 professional astrologers. I don't remember the latest count. Seems like that there were 5,000 professional astrologers here in this country. That is, people who write in, newspapers, horoscope, all this comes under the same thing. And I guess you realize horoscope and astrology and the zodiac all are the same thing. But 5,000 people, I don't know how many newspapers we have in this country, but that's a lot of people that do that for a living. Now, there are millions of people that follow that as a habit, but I'm talking about 5,000 people that do that for a living. Chart the stars, chart the skies, to tell us how they're going to influence us. Leviticus 19:26, a little bit earlier here. Ye shall not eat anything with the blood, neither shall ye use enchantment, nor observe times. Then in Isaiah 47:13 through 15. Isaiah 47, look at these verses, 13 through 15. Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. In other words, he's ridiculing the stargazers, astrologers, and the monthly prognosticators. Behold, they shall be as stubble. The fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor fire to sit before. Thus shall they be unto thee with whom thou hast labored, even thy merchants from thy youth. They shall wander every one to his quarter. None shall save thee. Well, he's coming against, in verse 13, your professional astrologers and soothsayers and those that use divination by means of the heavenly bodies. You see, there were other ways to use divination in the Old Testament. Of course, today we have things like your divining rod. Back then, they simply cut an animal open and looked in his liver. Or either they threw a couple of arrows down and tried to see which way they point to find out which way the army should march. I think that's all over in the book of Ezekiel there. But we're more sophisticated. We don't have sheep. We don't have the time to sit down and cut them open and pluck their liver out to enchant by them. We just have crystal balls now. That's all right in the Bible. Not crystal balls, I'm talking about the livers of animals. That's all right in the Bible. But we're more sophisticated, so we do our divining by other methods, by rods, you know. Jeremiah 10, verses 1 to 2 is another scripture you're to take in mind. The Bible condemns belief in astrology, so that couldn't be what Judges 5:20 is teaching us. See, right away, if we said it's poetry, that makes it suspect. Then secondly, if the rest of the Bible condemns belief in astrology, then right away we know we're not going to take Judges 5 and verse 20 in a literal manner. Jeremiah 10:1, Hear ye the word which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, Learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. Now it's talking about the signs of the heavens that the heathens are dismayed at, a certain arrangement of stars, a certain constellation. Remember, those 12 constellations come on the scene, each one of them for a month, to rule the heavens for a month. And if one of them's shaped like a bear, you see, Jesus called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. That's another one of their proof texts there. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, and one of the constellations is a lion. And you've got a bear and Scorpio and Sagittarius and all these other things there. And he said, don't be dismayed at them. They're there to glorify God, not to be dismayed at, to let you know this is going to be one of your down months if you were born under that particular sign. You see, this is what they teach. If you're born under a particular sign, and this gets, of course, definitely into the occult, then you have a metaphysical relationship to that particular constellation. It tells, already has foreordained certain things about you, your personality, and your disposition, and you are controlled and governed and ruled by those stars. Now, going back to Judges 5:20, if this verse can be taken literally, then that's exactly what they're saying here. These stars are fighting against Sisera. You know, maybe he was born under this particular constellation here, and it's just not his day now. But let me tell you what he does mean thirdly here in verse 20. We have to take verse 20, verse 21, verse 4, and chapter 4, and verse 7, all along with it. I'll give you those again here in a moment. But in chapter 5 of Judges in verse 20, he's simply saying that God has gathered himself and all the hosts of nature to fight against Sisera in a poetical manner. He's simply expressing that poetically, that I am against you, and with such fury that even the forces of nature are being brought against you. Now this can be proven from verse 4 and verse 21, because you know what's the major thing that defeats them? Rain that comes down from the sky. That's what defeats the enemy here. Rain comes from up there around where the stars are. Now, they knew that the stars weren't right by the clouds, but again, speaking with the language of appearance, the stars are right up there where the clouds are. That's where the rain comes from. And he goes on to mention the rain in verse 21 and along with verse 4. And this is the very thing that defeats their enemy. Well, first of all, before we read that verse, let's go back to chapter 4 in verse 7. Let's see if I've got a map with that on it. I don't, but I can show you where it is on this chart here. because the important thing here is to see where the river Kishon is. Now they are, of course, these people are from up north, but what God says in chapter 4 here of Judges is if you'll bring them down here to the river of Kishon. Now this is Mount Carmel, and Kishon was a river that flowed from right here down this angle, right through the plain of Esdraelon. That of course also is where the valley of Armageddon is. Armageddon and the plain of Esdraelon are essentially the same thing found here. And Kishon, the river Kishon, runs right down near Armageddon. Now they have encamped down here, their enemies are up north, and he said, bring them to this river and we'll fight there. Look in verse 7. There must be something particular, in other words, why he wants to get them near this river. And we find out what that is in chapter 5. I will draw unto thee to the river Kishon Sisera, the captain of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude, and I will deliver him into thine hand. Now we know that Sisera personally himself was killed in another way, in another manner. But it's his army that he wants to get here to this river. Why? Well, go back to chapter 5, verse 4. The very end of verse 4. The heavens dropped, the clouds also dropped water. Remember, he's got horses and he has his chariots of iron. That's the thing they can't overcome, remember. Well, I trust you realize what we're coming to. Verse 21, the river of Kishon swept them away, that ancient river, the river Kishon. O my soul, thou hast trodden downstream. There was a tremendous cloudburst at this time, filled that river to overflowing, and it simply swept all the people away. And of course, for those that it didn't sweep away, just the storm itself, the rain itself, would have made this particular plain, see, it's a plain and it's a flat area, which they would think is a good place to fight a battle with chariots. They're not going to be in mountains. They're in a plain here. But it was said during World War I. Of course, this is when Great Britain took Palestine from the Turks and made it the British mandate in 1917. But during World War I, the British got bogged down in the plain Esdraelon during a rainstorm, and no one could move anywhere. It got so muddy there. And so this is something else that we have taking place here in Judges 4 and 5. Not only is the majority of the army swept away, and it says that in verse 21, by a river that's overflowed her banks, but those that are left with their chariots are simply stuck right in the mud. And so all Israel has to do is come in and execute what and who needs to be executed. So if you read verse 21 along with verse 20, he's not talking about the literal stars themselves as fighting, but the heavens. Because rain was the major thing that defeated the people here. Well, that answers it well enough for me. I don't know if it answers it for you, but I mean, as a Christian, see, I'm going to have to deal with that verse. I can't just say that verse is not there. I mean, that's what everyone else does. They want to just find the verses that say what they want them to say. Now, if we can find a verse that says, allegedly, what we don't want it to say, then there must be some explanation. I don't mean not what we want it not to say, but if it contradicts some other portion of the Scriptures. Then all we got to do is put them side by side, and one of them's got to be right. I mean, right literally. Well, 2 Kings 23 and verse 5, I trust you see that. You're not going to have contradictory passages in the Scripture. You're not going to have God telling the Israelites, now I forbid you to observe times, and then he goes right over there and says, but I'm going to use those stars, and that's how I'm going to fight against your enemies. That's not going to make any sense. 2 Kings 23 and verse 5. Now this is another one of the negative scriptures concerning the zodiac and concerning astrology itself. 2 Kings 23:5. He put down the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense in the high places, in the cities of Judah and in the places round about Jerusalem. Them also that burned incense unto Baal, to the sun, to the moon, and to the 12 signs, and to all the host of heaven. You see, that's what you got in your margin there. It's the zodiac here. The zodiac was known and seen all the way back then. People worshipped the zodiac and knew, or at least thought, that it had a particular influence on people's lives. Now, we'll look at that a lot more in depth in some other scriptures whenever we teach on, the occult or some false cults or something on the subject of astrology. Then we can give you some more facts and statistics about that. But I think it's rather obvious. All you need are one or two passages where God says, like in Deuteronomy 18, whenever you go into the land, then don't learn after the abominations of those nations, and that ought to be enough for a Christian. Now, if they just want to believe in astrology, then it doesn't matter how many Deuteronomy 18s you're going to find, they're still going to believe it. But for those that are sincere with an open heart, want to do what the Scriptures teach, rather than their own preconceived ideas and notions, then Scriptures such as Deuteronomy 18 and especially Jeremiah 10 ought to be obvious enough. There are other things like the biorhythmic charts that people print up, and you can buy them in health stores and chiropractors and a lot of things like that. I used to go to a chiropractor, so I know what chiropractors are like. I had incurable migraine headaches. That's just amazing what they can call incurable, and I hadn't had one for years, But I had incurable migraine headaches. And I went there, and I just as soon do acupuncture or something, because all you do is lay down there and he pops your back and twists your bones, and that's supposed to rearrange my brain in such a way that I stop having those headaches. And I always got a headache whenever I went there, because he would bend me around so many different ways that I would generally leave there with a headache. They put me in the hospital, and I can remember looking at myself in a mirror, and I looked like Frankenstein. I had wires running out of my head. They had those electrodes stuck all over my head, monitoring all the responses of my brain to find out what was wrong with me. And, of course, you become a Christian, you find out it's a demon. And you'll never find that thing with electrodes or anything like that. You can look for him, but you'll never find that rascal, because he's spirit. And, he could manifest himself, but he'd scare all the doctors, and they'd never tell anyone, because then they're going to be put in that group, that class of people that, got a miraculous healing. And they don't believe in miraculous healings. They just say an unexplainable healing took place. That's much better than a miraculous cure, because then you got to believe in the deity, some type of deity. Well, I've given you the testimony before. I remember throwing that medicine I had out in our lake behind our house, and delivered from that. I was born with those, got them from my mother because she had them, picked up the same spirit that she had. And I don't know where she got them from. And whenever I had those things, they had to I took a suppository, put me to sleep, because I couldn't stand the pain or the pressure. And I would waste 3 and 4 days at a time sound asleep. Just sound asleep for 4 days at a time, because I could not stand that pressure. It would just make me about go out of my mind. And I was raised in the church, and they should have known that that's not God doing things like that. That's an evil spirit that does things like that. And you have to have those things cast out and believe by faith for your healing. So I got healed of that incurable disease there. I can't remember what got me on that subject. What did I say that got me on that? Oh, chiropractors. Oh, I was Oh, yeah. That was in South Haven, Mississippi. We lived right on the border in Tennessee and Memphis. We had to drive across the border to go down to Mississippi and go to this country chiropractor. I mean, he didn't do it on his back porch or something. He had an office there. But it wasn't any better than what I'd get on his back porch. Exorbitant fees to know how to pop my back the right way. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having your back popped if it feels good, but not for some medical reason to correct your headaches or something like that. You see, some people, of course, they say, well, that worked for me. Or, that acupuncture, that worked for me. No, it didn't. The demon just left one area and he picked up in another area. That's right. You may never find where he is the next time, which will even be worse then. I mean, he may go from a physical ailment to a spiritual ailment then you'll never get rid of him by acupuncture or chiropractors or anything. But they're smart enough to know it's time to leave, and they'll leave that area and go to some other area. But you have to stay covered with the blood to stay away from those things, and those things to stay away from you. Well, we need to come on to look at some more signs here. First of all, we've looked at the zodiac. We know that's not what he means here in Genesis 1. So what does he mean when he talks about the luminaries being created for signs? Well, basically for supernatural events. Some of them past, that is from our point of time, and some of them future. Supernatural events, past and future. Anyone have an idea what some of these might be? Let's start with the past ones here first of all and see how far we can get. Think about the luminaries and how they've been used, not as a light or as a calendar, but as a sign. What comes to your mind then?
Birth of Jesus.
Okay, the birth of Jesus. There we go. We've got a star. It's a supernatural sign. What else do we have? Shadow going back, and the sun stopping. Those are the three basic things there. Let's deal with them in order. Joshua chapter 10, known as Joshua's long day. What actually took place is our question in Joshua chapter 10. Joshua 10, verses 12 through 14. What actually took place here? Let's read the verses and then look at the views. Then spake Joshua to the Lord in that day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and hasted not to go down about a whole day. And there was no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord hearkened unto the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Well, there are three views, or three categories of views here. First of all is the darkness view, held by many, many conservatives. So remember this. It's known as the darkness view. And they want to translate the word in verse 12, stand still, just as you have in your margin, be silent, which it can be translated, be silent. Now, what this means, the darkness view, is that what Joshua is really praying, where he said, sun, stand still, he didn't say, sun, stand still, he said, sun, be silent. In other words, they are fighting a terrific battle here, and the sun is so bright and so hot, it's wearing all of them out. So he calls for supernatural darkness, rather than a prolongation of light, a supernatural darkness, somehow to cover the sun up, clouds or whatever you want to cover the sun up with, to block off its heat and its light so that Israel can finish the battle here. And that's why you got over in your margin, be silent. Sun, be silent. In other words, withhold your heat, withhold your power, so that we can avenge ourselves of our enemies. That was given prominence by Robert Dick Wilson. You see, he's a conservative, or was a conservative. He's not alive anymore. Robert Dick Wilson, back in 1918, in the Princeton Theological Review. He was one of the great professors there, along with people like Dr. Hodge and Dr. Warfield, who was a professor there at Princeton University. That used to be a good conservative seminary at that time. Not anymore, but used to be at that time. He wrote an article in the Princeton Theological Review in 1918 advocating this view, the darkness view, that really what took place here was some type of darkening of the sun. Then a second view is that this is poetry and is not to be taken literally. But when you read the end of verse 13 and verse 14, it's rather obvious that this is some type of literal account. There are not many people that hold to the poetic view here. Most people hold to one of the other views, either the first one or the next one that I'll be giving you. But you read the account here, and it's a literal battle. It's really taking place here, and it says there was no day like this before or after that the Lord hearkened to the voice of a man. It appears to be quite literal, and we know it to be quite literal in what's taking place here. And so then thirdly, a third view is that we have a prolongation of light. Now again, you can fit many, if not most, conservatives under this position, but there are some subdivisions under this. Some conservatives hold to the darkness view. I don't remember off the top of my head what Keelan DeLeach holds to in their Old Testament commentaries. But they're conservatives, and it seems to me that they might hold to the darkness view, if not one of the erroneous views here under a prolongation of light. Now there are several subdivisions under this. First of all, one man held that a comet came near the earth and in some manner was able to prolong the light. This man's name was Emanuel Velikovsky. He's written a lot of things about these miraculous events and written a lot on creation that's wrong. Emanuel Velikovsky, Velikovsky. Emanuel Velikovsky. Secondly, George Williams in the Student's Commentary says that God tilted the earth. So a tilted earth view. Thirdly, held by many conservatives such as Dr. John C. Whitcomb, which you'll have in your books and on your charts you have because we use Dr. Whitcomb's material, but he's got a wrong view here, is that we have a miracle of light refraction. A miracle of light refraction. We're not going to have time to explain these. We're going to do that next week. And then fourthly, which is what we believe to be the correct view that we'll get into more next time, we have a literal slowing down of the earth's rotation. The second greatest miracle in the Bible, by the way. I'll let you figure between now and next week what's the greatest. Well, we've got to stop there. We're out of time. We'll finish next week because we've got some more things to say on that. We'll explain those phrases and those views, such as the comet and the light refraction.
For a complete